And welcome, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Branca Show. I am back from my motorcycle trip to Vegas and glad to be here on the regular schedule with all of you today, where we're going to talk about Alec Murdaugh. Alec Murdaugh with a special guest. I wasn't sure he'd be able to make it, but my buddy and defense attorney extraordinaire, Steve Gosney, will be joining us on the screen in just a minute. Of course, you'll recall that Alec Murdaugh had been convicted of killing his wife and son, and he's won a new trial over those murder convictions. Now, let there be no mistake, Alec Murdaugh is a contemptible human being. His admitted financial crimes, defrauding clients, handicapped clients as an attorney, stealing from grieving families, betraying every duty an attorney owes to his clients and his colleagues and the courts, that earns him every minute of the lifetime prison time those crimes carry. But that's not the same thing as murder. On the murder charges, the prosecution's case was almost entirely circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses, no recovered murder weapons, no confession, no forensics transfer linking him to the killings. To paper over those gaps, the prosecution flooded the trial with months, well, at least weeks, of unrelated bad character evidence about his financial misconduct, uncontestable financial misconduct. This is exactly the kind of propensity evidence that courts are meant to keep out of a trial. So you have to ask, did the jury convict him on proof of murder beyond a reasonable doubt, or did it convict him on his well-earned bad reputation for financial crimes? And this conviction was further tainted by the self-serving book publishing shenanigans of court clerk Becky Hill, whose misconduct appears to have been the foundation for the South Carolina Supreme Court's decision to overturn Murdaugh's murder convictions. The bottom line is that even the worst of us is entitled to due process and conviction only on proof beyond a reasonable doubt on the charges before us. That principle doesn't exist to protect just good people. It exists to protect the worst of us, because if the worst of us don't receive due process, why would any of us expect to receive it? So in this live stream, we're going to walk through our memories of the case. I know I watched every minute. I can't remember if Steve had the opportunity to watch the whole thing. He'll let us know. And of course, there are a few criminal defense attorneys out there who could bring the kind of insight that my buddy Steve Gosney can bring to these kinds of cases. Welcome, Steve. Welcome.
Hello. Can you hear me?
We can. Yeah. Awesome. How you doing, buddy?
I've got a little echo. So yes, good to see you. It's been a while. Everybody, let's chat on and make sure we're good.
Yeah, I think the last time we were together like this in real time, face to face, might have been actually in person.
Yes, that's true. That is true. Yeah, it's always good to see my friend Andrew and Andrew Branca, of course. You know, a little last but I am now practicing law in South Florida, doing criminal law, and I did a 2-year civil law diversion. And I'm now doing criminal law in a general practice firm. There's a firm called Lance Law, and it's a South Florida general practice firm. So if anybody has any legal questions or legal needs, I can help them, or maybe I can refer somebody within our firm. So that's sort of an opportunity. So they were saying, well, what can you do?
Hey, Steve, hold on 1 second. I think there may be something wrong with your audio that's on my end.
Okay.
Let me see if I can adjust that. I think I'm going to take you out and bring you back in and see if I can fix that. Hold on a second. Check.
Can you
All
hear
right,
me?
Steve. Yeah, why don't you do your whole introduction again? Because I think your audio was screwed up from my end, and I don't think anybody could understand what you were saying.
Okay.
So tell us about yourself, Steve. My good friend Steve Gosney.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. And Andrew has been a friend of mine for quite a while now. And so I get to get the points for the Andrew Branca chat. No, but I'm board certified criminal trial lawyer. I did 28 years as a lawyer, 20 years in criminal practice, including prosecution, defense, and also appeals, multiple appeals. I did death penalty stuff before the appellate courts in Florida. I took a 2-year diversion into civil recently, and I'm now back in civil. I'm back in criminal practice in South Florida. So if anybody has a criminal case in South Florida, they can call me. I'm with a company called Glance Law, and it's a general practice firm, very good people. And so if you have any kind of legal need in South Florida, I think I can probably refer you or maybe help you if it's a criminal matter or injunctions. I do some other tangentially connected things. And yes, and you asked about the Murdaugh case. That was the last case I think I followed pretty much front to back, and I had a channel for quite a while and have been neglecting it because of the diversion that I've taken. But yeah, so this is sort of, I'm putting my toe back into the water a little bit, but mainly because, first of all, you're Andrew Branca and you're one of my favorite, and also that I do have a lot of thoughts and opinions on what happened with Murdaugh and commented on it a lot at the time as an appellate lawyer. Not a South Carolina appellate lawyer, but as an appellate lawyer, seeing all the errors that the prosecution made in this case. And we talked about it a lot when it was going down. And you and I have had long conversations on this case. And now here it is. Why should prosecutors follow the law? Why should prosecutors be on their best behavior? Why should they be humble? Exactly for this reason, because now they're going to put everybody through this again. And it was a completely self-made error. And I'm not just talking about the victim. I'm talking about the victim.
You say error. Of course, these were legal errors. That's why it got reversed. But a lot of these errors, in my view, were malice by the prosecutor. I mean, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how far they were overreaching. They knew it was inappropriate. And they were doing it anyway because they knew they had a highly circumstantial case and they desperately wanted the conviction. They were willing to do anything.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous, and that is a major. And I've been a critic of prosecutors for a long time because that is not the role of the prosecutor. The prosecutor is to uphold the law, and you know what that means? That means following the law, even when you don't like the defendant, even when you don't like the circumstances. It is not to get conviction at any cost. That is absolutely wrong, and I really, this was a very bad prosecution. Very bad prosecution. And I predicted at the time that it would come back on the and we'll get into the things on the second point, which was the overwhelming evidence of guilt on the thefts, which he has pled to and which were really bad. I get it. And he's like you said, he's a bad guy. He should be life in prison. Absolutely. But it doesn't make him a murderer. And it so overwhelmed the murder case that it became the trial was on they never even got to the murder case like 3 weeks in. And so, and that was the one I predicted. Now, I would say that reading the opinion, and sneak preview here, reading the opinion, I would say that they were going to reverse on both those grounds. The first ground we'll talk about in a second, which was the tampering by the clerk. But the other ground, I think they also would have reversed on. They chose to reverse on the other one and then commented on the second one. So, but yeah, at the time, it's like prosecutors follow the law, do the law, be humble, be fair. Even when you think the guy's guilty of sin, that's even more the reason you should be fair and follow the law, because your job as a prosecutor is to follow the law. But when they are doing these things and making these errors and making these things in order to win, they are losing because they are not following the law and they are betraying their oath as a prosecutor.
Yeah, so I thought there were lots of grounds for reversal here, but they went with the Becky Hill thing, the county clerk who was writing a book about this trial, who told her friends, and we're going to hear all about this in the decision when I read through it. So I don't want to spend too much time on the details, but she was writing a book. She told her friend, "Oh, the book will sell better if it's a guilty verdict." She was speaking to the jury about, don't be misled by the defense. Don't let them lie to you or fool you. I mean, have you, in your experience, have you seen court clerks act like this?
Well, it's interesting. I have a friend who does jury investigations post-conviction. Okay, and she has investigated over 100 juries for juror misconduct. And I was of the opinion, having been a prosecutor and a defense attorney, I'm like, that just doesn't happen, right? The jurors, people respect the juries, people do that. But as I get older and more cynical, and as these conspiratorial thoughts become verified by evidence that I am becoming less impressed by prosecutorial ethics. And I think that they load the juries with friendly jurors. The clerks work for guilt. And I mean, I tell you, the system is really messed up. And because of the betrayals of oaths, the betrayals of what the system is supposed to be. You play a role in the system and trust the system to produce a just outcome. When you put your finger on the scales of justice, you are betraying the system and you are creating injustice.
Yeah, I've often said that, in my view, too many of these prosecutors, they think they're Batman. They think they're the Punisher. They think they're some graphic novel vigilante who's supposed to seek justice within their own definition of what justice is, what they think is fair, completely independent of any concept of due process of law. They're not willing to properly lose. I mean, just not achieve the conviction if it can't be done within the proper legal boundaries. It's unacceptable to them. It must be conviction at any cost.
Which is wrong. In fact, the closer the case, you would think, well, if somebody is overwhelmingly guilty, then focus on the law and the facts and they will get convicted. If it's a close call, focus on the law and facts because you might convict an innocent person.
Yeah, and let's remind everybody, the prosecutor doesn't know what actually happened. The prosecutor wasn't there either, right? None of us were there. Nobody knows the truth in any absolute sense. The jury wasn't there. The judge wasn't there. The prosecutor, the cops, no one was there when all this went down. We're all looking at the evidence, and we're supposed to be making reasonable inferences from the evidence. And if the jury believes, but the prosecutor should be making this assessment too, of course, if we believe that guilt has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, it's an appropriate conviction. And we do that even though we know sometimes innocent people are convicted under that standard. But we don't demand perfection in prosecution, but it's a very high standard. And the high standard is what we would want for ourselves if we were charged, or anyone we cared about if we were charged. And if we're going to demand it for ourselves in a civilized society, we also have to provide it to everyone else who's entitled to due process of law.
Right. Well, and a good example of another, I would say, betrayal. I really do not feel that the financial crimes evidence became the trial. If by the time we got to any murder evidence, it was already over. I mean, they had put so much stuff in about how he robs little children and injured people, and it was over by
for
the
weeks.
time they got everything. For weeks, right? And the thing is that the theory that the state was prosecuting, that was bringing in these financial crimes, was I think an absurd overreach, and that is they were saying, well, he was trying to get he was being discovered, so he needed a continuance in some civil case because all the financial classes which was absurd. It was a ridiculous stretch. I mean, you and I have done enough cases that it's like, is it a difficult thing to get a continuance in a civil case? I mean, it's so pro forma, but that thing would make him kill his wife and his son, who he loved beyond belief. But I mean, from what I've seen of the guy, that's all he cared about.
There was no evidence to the contrary.
It was a stupid theory, but it's like, well, we're going to advance that. The state said this. We're going to advance that because we want to bring in all this slime about his financial misdeeds. We don't want to focus on the murder evidence. We want to focus on what a bad guy he is. And that's what they did. And it was really, I think that decision was improper on the prosecutor's part.
Yeah, I mean, so that was their theory for motive, right? And to my ear, it sounds ridiculous. To your ear, it sounds ridiculous. If they had advanced it and they'd said, listen, we want one person, two people to come forward and talk about his financial misconduct. It'll take an hour, Your Honor, just to put it in the record, because that's our motive, right? That's the narrative. The state gets to tell a story to the jury too. I would have said, well, it sounds stupid to me, but all right. But there's a concept called cumulative evidence, right? Where you just have piece after piece after piece after piece come on until the whole ship capsizes. And now you're outside the bounds of due process.
Right. That's right. And it became the trial, the financial crimes. And it was absurd. At the time, the whole time, I'm like, this is going to come back on appeal on that issue. Now, the clerk tampering, I thought that the defense attorney did a very good job of preserving that issue for appeal. It was really not a big, I mean, it was a big deal at the time, but it didn't take a lot of time on the part of the court when they dealt with that issue. If you remember, it was a day or maybe a half a day of evidence and questions and stuff. But that's what the court reversed on the jury tampering issue from the clerk. Now, I do think that it's a lot more common than what we realize. You had asked about this earlier. The juror tampering, when staff members in the courts will wink and nod on. I mean, I've had judges on the bench roll their eyes whenever the defense attorney is talking. That is so improper. They are like, looking at, they're making all this body language to communicate to the jurors, I don't like this defendant. Why can't we just have fair trials? I mean, do we even believe in fair trials? And who should really believe in fair trials? Judges and prosecutors. But, and thankfully, the Supreme Court of South Carolina still believes in fair trials, but these people are bubbling up from below, and maybe they will populate the Supreme Courts, and then it's like, then what? There's no law. I mean, you either believe in the law or you don't, and if you do, then you need to listen to what we're saying, because this is it's such a waste of time. It's a waste of money. It's a distraction. It is injustice. It's everything that we should fight against as lawyers. But yet here we are.
Yeah. And how about Dick Harpootlian, the defense attorney for Murdaugh? That guy's, I mean, he's a pit bull, man. He's never given up. He was relentless as defense counsel during the trial, and he's never stopped.
Right. No, he's excellent. And that kind of relentless defense attorney. Well, you remember my buddy Rosemarie. She's my definition of relentless. And I can be a little bit relentless when needed, when need be, right? I mean, I think it's a quality of a defense attorney to be able to stand up in a room and everybody hates you and wants you to sit down and shut up. And yet you stand up and you say, Your Honor, objection. This is improper. This is wrong. And that's what we're dealing with here, is the courage to stand up when everybody hated. Because I mean, this guy was hated even when I was speaking, because I don't know South Carolina, I don't know this area law, and when I was commenting on it and saying, I'm not sure if he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I have my suspicions. I think there's exculpatory evidence. There were people that would the hatred that I would get from these people that lived in this area around him that were like, you don't know what kind of people they are. You don't know this, and it was irrational, emotional hate. And but we've got, as a defense attorney, you've got a client and you've got to call it, and you've got to stand up for the injustice when you see it, even when it's against somebody who's terrible, bad guy, right?
Speaking of hatred, have you heard about this case of this guy Chud? Chud, he's a social media provocateur. He goes out in the community and he calls people the N-word and asks them if they're going to chimp out in response. And he got into a physical confrontation. Yes, I guess it was yesterday. A black dude punched him, and he pulled out a gun and shot the black dude. And now he's been charged. I think he's been charged with attempted manslaughter. Fortunately for him, the person he shot survived. And I'm about to start talking about the legal realities of all this. Of course, right now we're here. Steve and I are here to talk about this case. But tomorrow morning, I'm going to be talking about Chud, the legal reality of Chud. And I've just made a few comments on X so far about this, about the legal realities here, because people are like, well, black people commit a lot of crime, and they shouldn't become violent just because the N word is used, and lots of things that could be true, but they're completely legally irrelevant to this guy shooting that dude, and none of that is going to come at the trial. And the amount of hate I'm getting from injecting legal reality into this confrontation is, it's not surprising because I felt it before, but we'll be covering that again tomorrow morning, folks. People keep asking me, are you going to cover Chud? The answer is yes. I'm going to cover Chud.
And the answer from Ghazi's perspective is no, I will not be here when Andrew decides to take on this political hot potato. I will be far away.
All right, so let me hit a couple super chats. People are very happy to see you here, Steve. Look at this. Look at this. Always great to hear from Steve Ghazni, from one of my members. Let's see, I'm back in my office, so I have my sound effects. The members get applause. Did you hear applause? Did that work or did it not work?
I didn't hear it.
Oh, okay. I have to do the audio differently when I have a guest, so I guess my sound effects don't work. Tama Drummer, $10 says, in the past 8 years, prosecutors and judges have placed huge weights on the scales of justice. It's totally criminal, and I cannot see how we fix it. Longer than that, of course, but the first shocking example I had in my experience when I saw how egregious it really was the George Zimmerman prosecution. But of course,
well, that's when we first met, actually.
Yep.
Was that case, and you were the reason I reached out to you, because I said you're the only guy that knows what he's talking about on that, and then you're like, oh, good, you were on Legal Insurrection, William Jacobson's channel. Yeah.
Has Steve written an article on this yet? So Steve writes a great many articles and a great many books, and his URL is right there, steveghazni.com. So be sure to check him out.
The solution, in my humble opinion, is that we have failed as in the West of in our individual building. I think it's a crisis of faith at the individual level that's been spread out, and it's widespread. And my book, my book Prepare, I've edited down now into a book called Freedom, Faith, and Truth, and that is really an individual prescription to people to improve themselves. And because the problem is that we have broken individuals who are amoral and have lost their faith, and these people are now populating the prosecutor's office, they're populating the judges, they're populating the jury pools, and our society is collapsing, in my opinion, because of a crisis of faith in the West. And my last book, it's kind of an edited version of Repair, is kind of the prescription to that, is that we need to do our individual work. It's really a Carl Jung idea. Carl Jung says, are we going to survive as a species? And he said, if enough people do their inner work. And so this was kind of my contribution to the inner work idea. But that's what we're seeing. We're seeing, prosecutors who think that they're golden. They have so much power. The scales have been tipped so hard that even they can convict and prosecute and get guilty pleas out of innocent people, extract them because of the threats and the terrible threats. And so they think, I'm a great lawyer, and I'm the world Batman, like you said, the Batman symbol. They're going to solve evil through their power of the pen. And what they end up doing is creating a lot of human wreckage and injustice, rather than being humans and understanding the fallen state of humanity and providing some judgment. It's like, well, let's just convict, and that'll solve the world's problems. No, justice is a flawed but necessary process that needs to go through the whole society. And you're not going to achieve perfection and nirvana through government. We're all fallen men. And so we need to have a recognition that you're not going to solve the crime problem. You're going to manage it. And you manage it through justice, not through unwieldy power.
Couldn't agree more. Ghazni, good to see you, Brother Branca. And Brother Branca just wanted to share that God recently blessed Lady Ree and I with a beautiful, healthy son. God bless you all. Well, congratulations, man.
Lord of the Ree, man. Good to see you. This is the folks from way back.
Some modest criticism here. Steve is overly agreeable. Steve is a very nice guy, no question about that. But if you see him practicing law, he's as much a pit bull as Harpootlian is. Trust me.
Well,
the guy is relentless.
You can disagree professionally and based on the law and and look, nobody's perfect. I'm fallen too, but there's a way to disagree legally, and we've kind of lost that. It becomes this emotional game. I see so many young prosecutors that want to bring in, it's like they just want to pour emotion on things. And I don't think the process is meant to be rational. And so you talk about law and facts. I had a great prosecutor named Steve Nelson who trained me along with John Tanner. And that was what they always said. It's like, what's that have to do with the facts? What's that have to do with the law? And it's like, well, he's a bad guy. Well, really? What's that have to do with the facts? And that's
if that's the standard, you don't need courts, right? You can just hang someone from the nearest tree. I mean, you just don't like them. You feel negatively about them. Let's just take them out.
Let's score them.
The reason we have courts is to rationalize this process, remove the emotion from it. Let's see. Mark of Reality says, gotta love those pit bull defense attorneys. Well, I would certainly agree with that. And Mark of Reality has been a member for 14 months. I can't even believe I've had memberships for 14 months. That means Mark, by the way, is going to be able to join us for today's members only show, which is looking at the case of E. Jean Carroll's lawsuit against Trump, a very powerful dissent that just came out of I guess it was the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, explaining why this lawsuit is complete and utter nonsense. It's a very long opinion, so I covered the first half of it a few days ago. We're going to finish it up as a members-only show right after this show, right after we cut Steve loose. But for now, of course, we're talking about Alec Murdaugh. So a few of the problems, because this trial went on for a long time, and it was a few years ago now. So it's easy to forget how crazy. I mean, how many weaknesses there were in this state's case. So I'm just going to step through a few of these and just share like my recollection. We're not going to dive deep into these, but and you can share your recollection, Steve. But like, for example, the murder weapons here were never in evidence. And not only were they not in evidence, but the state actually introduced weapons, firearms from the Murdaugh home that were not involved in the crime as if they were part of the crime.
Right. Well, and that was it was very weak, because what they did is they said, look at all these guns and let's parade all these guns that came out of the house. It's like, and then the mechanism, another thing, I remember one of my biggest streams I had that on Rumble was demonstrating with a AR-15 how the state's theory of what happened could not have happened. It was physically impossible for the positioning of the gun and the wounds. Now, and there was also the Branca theory, which you talked about it, and it became kind of my go-to thought pattern about the alternative theory of murder. And there were multiples, but the one that I liked was the Branca theory, and let's talk about the Branca theory, because his son was involved in a DUI homicide with a boat, right? And he got away with it. He basically got no sanction really for it. And so that was the son that was murdered eventually. This is a small community. This is a privileged and hated family. And here's a guy. Now, this thing is consistent. What happened here was consistent with some classmate of the girl who was killed on this boating accident. And here's this privileged family that got away with it. And all he has to be is somebody that admired this girl from afar, to stay and lay in wait with a shotgun in that thing for the son to come out and then shoot him, and then pick up the firearm and shoot the wife. That to me was very, very plausible, and it was never to me adequately disproven. So there is a reasonable hypothesis of alternative theory that was not disproven. And then there was also, if I remember, this is from memory, the cell phone was tossed in a different direction from where Murdaugh went. So there was actually exculpatory evidence in the cell phone, the way the cell phone was handled after the death. That was the wife's cell phone was tossed in a different direction, if you remember that. And there was a number of problems with this case. There were a lot of problems with this case. And some other people said it could have been somebody involved with the drugs, the pills. But I kind of like the friend of the girl, because it was a hatred directed towards that son. And then the wife's there also, so let's do her too. So that to me was very possible.
Especially if the wife stumbles on the scene, right? You shoot the son with the shotgun, you think you're all done, so you put your shotgun down, and then the wife stumbles on the scene and you grab the nearest weapon, which happens to be the son's rifle, and use that. Otherwise, it's difficult to imagine where if your intent is to kill both these people, why would you kill the first one with a shotgun and then switch to a rifle to kill the second one? It almost sounds like it would have to be two killers, right?
Well,
each wielding their own weapon.
A double barrel shotgun, and then you're out of ammo, and here this kid's got the thing, and the wife's there trying to film. You shoot her, you take the phone, you toss it on the way out in the different direction from when Murdaugh went. It was just, there's so many problems that there was never any shotgun introduced, right?
There was never, well, I think they may have introduced a shotgun, but it would have been from inside the home. It was not connected. Yeah, they did, because another thing they did was they tried to say, well, we found these shot shells inside the home that are consistent with the shells that would have killed these people. It's like, there's not that much variety in shot shells.
Yeah.
I mean,
Winchester 12 gauge, right?
Right. It's not like it was some esoteric brand or something that you could specifically identify.
We spent so much time watching this trial, and I was really wanting to see the state's evidence, but it got so buried in everything else, and it was so confusing. And the jurors would be I would be very surprised if they weren't confused. Oh, well, there was the gun. There's the gun. They brought it in. There was a shotgun. Right. There was the shells, right? I mean, it was all very tricky and confusing. And
especially if people don't own guns, right? If they're not gun people, or even if they own a gun, right? They buy a 9mm pistol for home defense. They buy one box of ammo. They throw it in their dresser drawer. They forget all about it. But this was a hunting cabin. I mean, there was a lot of guns there. There's a lot of shotguns. There's a lot of ammo, lots of different types of guns. And if you don't live in that world, it could seem bizarre, right? Like, well, obviously they had the similar type of ammo. They must have done it.
Right.
And there's an important principle here, and that is all this evidence is circumstantial. There's actually no direct evidence. Especially in a circumstantial case, what's the definition of reasonable doubt, right? In the jury instructions, they'll say, well, it's just a reasonable doubt. It's the kind of thing you would apply to the most important affairs in your life, and very vague, ambiguous kind of jury instructions. But a pretty good workman's understanding is, listen, if there's a reasonable hypothesis that's consistent with innocence, that's a reasonable doubt. Then you have not been convinced beyond a reasonable doubt of guilt. And there was a lot of that, I thought, throughout this trial. And another weird piece of evidence they submitted was the 911 call when Alec Murdaugh comes across the bodies of his wife and son and calls the police. They play that recording of the 911 call and they say, oh, look, he doesn't sound upset, right? His demeanor is kind of flat. And the truth is, with any demeanor evidence, it's almost like the ammo selection thing, right? It's like, it's always the wrong one. Whatever you did was wrong. If you're crying, you're acting. If you're not crying, you're too calm, your affect is too flat. That also suggests guilt.
Yep, that's right. I mean, there was so much. I remember there were like body language experts saying, trying to analyze what he was doing and all this. And that is always a mistake. I mean, I want hard objective evidence. And beyond the reasonable doubt standard, from the state, I demand clear theories of guilt, clear evidence, clear ... And here's what charted out. Confusion is the ally of the defense.
Right.
But this prosecution was nothing but confusion. And to me, that is covering weakness. And I remember watching this whole thing and just being very unimpressed with the prosecution, basically stomping all over what they should be doing. Draw me a picture, pretend I'm stupid, and give me a paint by numbers thing, because that's what it should be. And if it's not, then there's a problem with your case.
It's always been my view that the moment the prosecution starts offering to the jury alternative theories of guilt, that should be reasonable doubt right there. Even the prosecutor doesn't know what happened, right? He's saying, even I don't have a coherent single theory of guilt here. It's like, well, if you don't believe he's guilty this way, then consider this way or consider that way, or just give me a guilty verdict one way or another. Another huge question here was that there was never any actual time of death. I mean, the medical examiner gave like a 2-hour window time of death. And of course, the prosecutor, now they're trying to pin Murdaugh not just to the scene, because this is his property. So they were shot by some dog kennels. And of course, Alec Murdaugh was by those dog kennels all the time. It's his property. The relevant question is, well, was he there at the time of death? I mean, that would be important to know. But we don't have a time of death. We have this 2-hour window. And then we have a lot of nonsense the prosecutor tried to do with, well, cell phones were moving and then not moving. And, when the prosecutor wanted the cell phone evidence to be favorable to conviction, it was perfect. It was incontestable. It was scientific fact. But then there was cell phone evidence that was not consistent. Like supposedly he threw the phone out the window, but the phone never recorded any motion. Like it would have to have been thrown perfectly flat and then landed perfectly flat and never tumbled. And because there's a what they call the kennel video. Murdaugh's dead son was, before he was killed, of course, was taking a video with his phone, and you can hear Alec Murdaugh in the background talking to the dogs. He says he was pulling a chicken away from one of the dogs, and people say, that's it. That's the evidence that he killed them. And later, unfortunately for Murdaugh, he would lie about this. He would lie to investigators about whether he was at the kennels anytime that night. And so the video definitely exposes that lie. The lie is a separate issue. I'm going to circle back to that. But unless you can connect the video to the time of death, it's not particularly material. He was entitled to be at his kennels anytime he wanted to. The lie is a problem because the lie could suggest consciousness of guilt. Consciousness of guilt is things like if you flee the scene of an event, it could look like you're attempting to flee to avoid identification or avoid accountability. And the jury can be instructed, hey, if you believe this person fled to avoid accountability, you're allowed to infer that they thought they were guilty too. They're acting with a guilty conscience. But if there's an alternative explanation for the conduct, it's not very compelling consciousness of guilt evidence. Lots of people flee a scene of a crime because they're like, oh shit, I have a prior conviction for something, and I know they're going to try to railroad me if I'm here when the cops get here. So I'm going to get out of here. Doesn't mean they necessarily did anything wrong. And by the way, another factor here, Alec Murdaugh knew some of these sled investigators, and he believed, and I think it was true, that they previously lied on other cases. And they lied in this case. They had to admit on the witness stand that they lied. They lied about blood being found, the wife's blood being found on his shirt, high velocity blood. It was never there. None of that blood was there. That's what they told the grand jury, though. We found the wife's blood on his shirt. That's how they got the indictment. And then on the witness stand in the trial, they had to confess. No, none of that was true. And so Murdaugh had a reason to lie about being at the kennel. That's completely consistent with innocence. I didn't kill my wife and kid, but if they think I was there around the time, they're going to try to railroad me. They're going to lie about the evidence in this case, and therefore I have to make up a lie to protect myself. Doesn't mean it's a smart plan, but it's an explanation for the lie that's not necessarily binding him to guilt.
And one of the again, going back to the Branca theory, which is always the alternative gunman who was related to this young girl that was killed in the boating accident, and somebody lying in wait with a shotgun for him. And then because the way that it was an ambush killing of the son, and then the wife was then killed with the AR, right? Using that theory, if Murdaugh, if he is leaving, he's going to go back to his house or go back and leave something. That guy hears, there's multiple here. There's the dad, and they're saying he's going to wait until that person leaves. Now Murdaugh leaves, and now he's got the son alone, or so he suspects, or at least with only the two people, and he kills the son. So I mean, it's possible that the killer, as an observer, could have been watching this whole scene and seen Murdaugh leave, and then done the killing, right? I mean, I think that I really would love to see a good state prosecution case, because I have a lot of reasonable doubts. I have questions. After watching that trial, I had a number of unanswered questions that the state did not fulfill. So to me, I have reasonable doubt as to this guy, why this man who loved his family, loved his wife, and you can hear he's just talking with him normally at the scene.
Right. There's no anger, and there's no animosity.
Really, he could be a thief and a scum, but not be a killer. And that's the thing. I mean, and so my reasonable doubts were never alleviated by that trial. And it's the state's burden. And this is where people fall down. They want to say, well, he's a bad guy. Yes, he's in prison for life. But if he didn't do it, then there's a double homicide murderer out there who got away with it. And that's we don't want that. And we also don't want to punish somebody for something they didn't do. I mean, especially when it's your wife and child. I don't know. I just really I'm pleased that the Supreme Court of South Carolina did what they thought they should have done. But it's sad that our prosecution teams and our cops, because there were some bad sled cops that lied to the grand jury, like you said, and that should be nowhere in our. I want honest cops. Why lie?
It's the same disease. It's the same Batman disease. It's the same. I'm pursuing what I think is justice, and therefore the rules don't apply to me. Yep, same disease. Same disease. All right, let me hit some of these. I've got a couple super chats here, and then we'll dive into the opinion. And I told Steve he can stay as long as he likes. You know, I'll be reading through an opinion. He can interrupt and interject, I should say, anytime he likes to share his expertise. But at some point, he may have to go, and if he does,
I do have to go at about at latest by 1. So, but
okay. I'll leave it up to you. The son of Bard, $5, says Chud is going to be decided on whether the N word qualifies as fighting words. May set precedents for some slurs entitling violence. I don't think Chud's going to be decided on anything having to do with the First Amendment. I think a lot of people think the First Amendment is much, much broader than it is. There's lots of speech, especially speech that provokes violence that's not protected by the First Amendment. Mark of Reality, $5. If they're parading through someone's perfectly legal gun collection, wouldn't that be a violation of FS 90?
Well, this is South Carolina, but yes, and I've actually had this issue in a trial before as a prosecutor.
So what is that statute? I'm not familiar with it.
Well, it's an evidentiary statute. That's the Florida 403 is the Florida evidentiary rule. But
I see.
And yes, you're correct. Okay, and Mark is correct. But I've had this very issue wherein there were multiple guns. And the defense fear, I remember prosecuting a case and defending a case with this issue. You know, as a prosecutor, I withheld parading the guns in front of the jury because that has no relevance to me. And the prejudicial effect is the probative value is outweighed by the prejudicial effect. You have perfect right to possess and own multiple guns. The fact that you're a gun guy does not make you a murderer. But prosecutors love to parade guns and point them at juries. Remember that? And they'd love to do all that stuff. I remember the case that I had. Oh, it's one of the most painful cases. That was point number 5 on a 6-point appellate brief that I did, wherein they wanted to show that this guy had all these guns in his house. There was only one gun that was used in the crime, and that's the only gun that should have been put in. But they want to show, oh, he's got all these guns, and they make it look bad. And that's exactly what this is. They should have resisted that temptation. But, you know, for whatever reason, they want to put it in there. I don't know. I mean, yes, Mark of Reality is correct. It is a violation, but only if the judge, only if the judge doesn't allow it. Only if the prosecutor decides to withhold prejudicial because, you know, let's face it, all evidence is prejudicial. Okay.
Right.
So is the probative value there? What is the probative value of having a gun collection? Okay. If somebody goes and defends their property.
You have to explain what probative means, Steve. We're speaking to a lay audience. So,
well, probative value. So, okay, we have prejudicial effect. Oh, okay. There's a witness that says, I saw the guy pull out a gun. He went outside, he pulled a gun and shot the guy in the head. Okay, well, that's pretty prejudicial for the defendant, but it's also admissible and relevant, right? Now, it is also very probative. That's probative of like you're looking at an event. Well, what is the prejudicial effect of that? Well, it's very prejudicial. Now, let's talk about, well, he also has a gun collection locked up in a safe in his bedroom. Well, that's disconnected from the crime, all right? So first of all, what is the probative value? What is the value of the evidence that he's got a gun safe full of guns?
Right. And by probative value, what we mean is it evidence that would help the jury answer the legal question being presented to them, right? Whether or not this is the guy who shot the victim. A gun collection at home is not probative. It doesn't help you answer that question. Direct eyewitness testimony that I saw him fire the shot into that guy's head, that's probative because it helps answer the legal question. Did the defendant shoot that dude?
The elements of the crime, a status of being a gun guy, to me is not probative of whether or not you did a particular criminal act. You look to the elements and see. Now, the prejudicial effect, though, of showering somebody, burying them in all their ammo, he's got, it's always an arsenal. And I'm like, really? That's an arsenal? It's like he has 4 ARs and 3 handguns. I'm like, and 2,000 rounds of ammo. He's like, it's an arsenal. I'm like, really? I know a lot of people that will outdo that arsenal every day of the week. But prosecutors, like you said, it's always going to be portrayed as sinister when there's a crime. So keep that out. You have a right to possess firearms. You don't have a right to use a firearm in a criminal episode. So if there's a firearm used in a criminal episode, introduce the firearm and anything that he is possessing if he has extra ammo on him. But don't introduce the safe collection that has nothing to do with the crime. And so that's what we're talking about. And that's what they did in this. And so it requires a prosecutor with discipline, but barring that, a judge who will enforce these evidentiary rules. But we didn't have either. And then if you don't have either, then it's up to appellate courts, which is nothing.
Does anybody remember Binger from the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, right? Finger on the trigger and everything. He's pointing this weapon at the jury. No sights on it, but nevertheless. And of course, that has an effect, right? I would be pretty pissed if I were in that jury box. This guy starts pointing a rifle at me.
That was horrible. And this is a semi-automatic weapon. Even though it doesn't have a magazine, it could still have one in the chamber. It could be cycled. And so you could have one shot in that, and that trigger could pull. I mean, now, I'm sure it's been checked by multiple parties, but the rules of firearm safety. And that he is violating multiple rules. We are not sure. You never are sure of any kind of firearm. Anyway, that was terrible. That guy was the worst.
Miss Lizzie Blue says, $10. This is the South. The fact that the defense never brought up the ease of someone pulling up on a four-wheeler and committing this crime shocks me. Immediate doubt. Yeah, maybe. Jack Wade, $5. What's your opinion of professional jurists? Why would they be any less corruptible than prosecutors or cops? I mean...
Well, but at least maybe one of the problems with jury selection is that you don't know who these people are. If the prosecutor is loading the jury with people that they favor, they know who they want to put on there. And you as a defense attorney are coming in cold. And the first time you see him is when you're sitting down, you got a million things to do. You're overwhelmed. And the last thing you're thinking about is doing social media checks. You don't have time to do that. And the judges are saying, counselor, move on, right? And so you don't get really a good chance. But if it's being loaded, then the state attorney's got a real advantage on that, and they can really stick it to you there in that jury selection by putting jurors on that they want. Now, the idea of a professional juror, at least we would know who these people are, and we'd have maybe a record, and we would have a pre-knowledge, and the defense bar and the prosecution bar could work it out. So I'm not sure professional jurors aren't a good idea. One of my big reform ideas, I think, is that the defense and the state should switch places every few years, because people get so obsessed with their power and they see it this is the way it is. And they need to switch around because they need to understand the defense perspective. I mean, I've got a prosecutor right now in a case I'm doing, and it's like, how can you represent this criminal? You're evil because you represent somebody who's accused of these crimes. No, I'm part of the system. I'm doing my job as part of the system, but she's been doing these crimes for 28 years, and that's it. And so it's like, this is it, and I'm right, and I'm good, and you're evil because you represent all these evil guys. I mean, it's just horrible. The worst people elevated into these positions of power that persecute citizenry. Play fair, do the right thing. The defense attorney has a role to play. Respect that role as a prosecutor. And same with the judge, where judges need to respect it. It's this gamesmanship that's being played. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it really comes from core values and individual action. But if these people are populating, I mean, they They chase everybody away. These people love power. Their God is power. And they've lost sight of what real faith is.
Yeah, a couple thoughts on jurors. I can definitely, especially in a politically energized case, I can understand the advantage of knowing something about the juror's background. Because normally you know nothing about the juror except they may have filled out a questionnaire or something like that. And jurors, in a politically charged case, jurors will lie to get on the jury so they can engage in what they think is justice. And I've definitely seen a difference in trials where the defense was well-resourced, had a good staff, and as jurors came up, they were having staff like go on the internet and background check all these jurors and get jurors knocked off for cause because these jurors were like, oh no, I don't have any preconceived notion. And meanwhile, they're running websites like, lynch this defendant, right? He needs to go to hell. And if you don't have those kinds of resources, you don't know anything about these jurors. And then they get put on the jury, and it's too late really to do anything about it at that point. Then you discover something after trial. Oh, he was really a protester at all these George Floyd events. It's like, well, that wasn't an appropriate person to be on the jury for Derek Chauvin, for example, but nevertheless, he made it on. The other thing is we've all heard the phrase jury selection, and I hate that phrase because it suggests that the lawyers get to choose the jurors, and it's not like that at all. We have a very modest ability to deselect individual jurors, but largely we're stuck with whatever jury pool that court is handing us.
Yep. That's correct. You should have my buddy Mary Rose on because she talk all about problems with juries.
All right, I'm going to pull up the decision now and start working through it. Let me see the best way to do this.
And and as a right brain thinker, I will give a preview while he's doing that. To me, I view this opinion in two parts. The first part is the reason for the reversal, which is the jury tampering by the clerk of court and comments and things that she had done that had tainted the jury and created an unfair situation. Okay. Then there's a commentary in the second part talking about all of the stuff we've been talking about mostly, which is the overwhelming amount of theft evidence and character evidence that pretty much dominated the trial for the first 3 weeks, and their commentary. And when I read it, they're talking about that. And when I read it, I say they would have reversed on that issue also, and they don't want that sort of trial to be repeated. Now, it's interesting some of the lines they draw in that in the second part. I'm very interested in the second part because that was my opinion originally. So there's really two parts of this opinion, the long part on the reversal, and then the second part talking about don't do this again on retrial.
Another interesting thing that just occurred to me, I just Googled it, is normally when you have a conviction and it's appealed and the conviction gets reversed and remanded for a new trial, it'll go back to the same judge from the first trial. And in this, which would be awkward because this judge was terrible. And the judge from the first trial is the one who
retired. Wasn't this his last?
Right. So that's why I wanted to bring it up because I don't believe he's an active member or maybe any member on the bench anymore. So it'll go to a different judge. So maybe we'll get more reasoned rulings.
Well, and I remember everybody slobbering over this judge, and everybody slobbers over judges. I mean, and the judges are human. And they're human beings with flaws, with biases, and I want a judge who is honest and smart, plays fair, and has an opinion, and rules. And this is this whole idea, this people worship power, and judges have a lot of power and prosecutors have a lot of power. Defense attorneys don't have a lot of power. You have power of persuasion. You have power of the law rationally followed. You have the power of the process. But if the other parties are not respecting the process and not following the law, then you really are powerless. And this is why these infringements on the process are so detrimental. Because it's like, well, why didn't you do something, Mr. Defense Attorney? Because the system has been corrupted. And it's a very sad commentary on the state of our law. I'm also concerned that there's probably a lot of people that have been railroaded by this prosecutor's office and these cops and this judge and everybody else who don't have the resources or the profile of Murdaugh. That Murdaugh's got the benefit of an appellate opinion because he's Murdaugh, he's a big deal. Does the little guy get the same consideration? I don't, not in my experience.
Yeah, so the prospects of, as you've noted many times, Steve, the prospects of getting any kind of win on appeal is virtually zero. And even what we would call meaningful relief on appeal is what, 0.06 or 0.6%, something under 1%?
Yeah, 0.6% in order to get some meaningful relief in appeal. I did an analysis of this in the 5th DCA in Florida, and the chances of some remedy are 0.6%. That's 6 out of 1,000. And of the 1,700 plus cases that I reviewed in 1 year in that court, there was one reversal that went from guilty to not guilty. One.
Right. Which almost never happens. Normally a big win on appeal is this: your conviction gets reversed, and you get to do the trial all over again.
Right.
With generally a lot fewer resources than you had the first time around. All right, let me pull this up. Let's see. Make it as big as I can here, because sometimes size does matter, right, ladies? All right, here's Harpootlian, the other lawyers for the defense, the attorney general for the state, I guess. What was the name of the original prosecutor? Is he listed here?
Probably not. Usually,
probably not. Right.
These are usually handed off to the attorney general's office in Florida, and it's not the trial attorneys. Now, in the defense side, it can be, but I would be surprised if the prosecutor in the trial level also did the appeal.
Yeah, normally trial attorneys and appellate attorneys are different people. They're different skill sets.
Yeah, although not always. I mean,
right.
I'm board certified criminal trial, and I've done 14 years of appeals. So, but it is a very different skill set. Writers, but generally appellate people are much more written readers and writers, and being a trial attorney is more like being a gunfighter.
Right. Okay, per curiam. So the whole court, I guess, normally that means there's not a particular author of the opinion. For 6 weeks in early 2023, the eyes of the nation focused on Colleton County, where the state prosecuted.
Here. This drama of this opening paragraph. This is just like not in Florida. But I mean, this is drama. This is where you get it. It's a high-profile case, and they want to show off how wonderful their writing skills are. So go ahead. Let's say it with drama.
I wish I could do a South Carolina accent. That would be perfect. Where the state prosecuted notorious former attorney Richard Alexander Murdaugh for the murders of his wife Maggie and son Paul. Both the state and Murdaugh's defense skillfully presented their cases to the jury as the trial court deftly presided over this complicated and high-profile matter. This is funny in appeals because the appellate courts will do this all the time. They speak positively about everybody, even when that's patently not the case. However, their efforts were in vain because that witch, Colleton County Clerk of Court Rebecca Hill, placed her fingers on the scales of justice, thereby denying Murdaugh his right to a fair trial by an impartial jury. Our justice system provides, indeed demands, that every person is entitled to a fair trial, even a dirtbag like Alec Murdaugh, which includes an impartial jury untainted by external forces bent on influencing the jury toward a biased verdict. Although we are aware of the time, money, and effort expended for this unnecessarily lengthy trial, we have no choice but to reverse the denial of Murdaugh's motion for a new trial due to Hill's improper external influence on the jury and to remand for a new trial. So again, sent back to the prosecutor's office. They get to decide, by the way, whether or not they want to retry him. They don't have to, but there's no doubt that they will here, of course. At least I certainly hope they will. It'll be good theater for us. Because we order a new trial on this basis, it's not necessary that we review every evidentiary issue Murdaugh raised on appeal from his conviction, and there were a ton of those, as we mentioned early on. However, we address the admissibility of Murdaugh's financial crimes to offer guidance on this thorny issue to the trial court on remand. So, when the Supreme Court of your state is offering you guidance the guidance to a lower court judge, a trial court judge? How seriously do they take that guidance, Steve, or ought to, if they're prudent?
Well, I think they will listen to this, but I'm not really impressed with the guidance that they offer, I will say. But they will listen to it. I just love the ly words. I will say, as an appellate writer, we avoid ly words. You know what the ly words are, right? You see that you can identify, jump out at you because
skillfully,
deftly. Did the court really deftly preside? I don't think it was very deftly. I think it was very clumsily.
Right. I would agree. So, factual and procedural background. On March 2nd, 2023, Murdaugh was convicted of the murders of his wife and his son, as well as 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. The trial court, Judge Newman, sentenced him to life in prison. While his direct appeal of these convictions was pending at the Court of Appeals, Murdaugh filed a motion to hold the appeal in abeyance to allow him to file a motion for a new trial. The Court of Appeals granted this motion. Murdaugh moved for a new trial, asserting that Becky Hill, court clerk Becky Hill, tampered with the jury by advising it not to believe Murdaugh's testimony and other defense evidence, and pressuring it to reach a quick guilty verdict, and misrepresenting information to the trial court in an attempt to have the court remove a juror she believed to favor the defense. Wasn't that the egg lady? Is that what they called her?
Yeah, the egg lady.
The egg lady? Because she brought in eggs to share with the other jurors. He attached affidavits from several jurors to support his motion. Chief Justice Beatty appointed former Chief Justice Toll to preside over this motion, as the trial court judge had recused himself, as well he should have. The post-trial court conducted the hearing. Let's see, how much of this do I want to go through?
The intro stuff is pretty good. The analysis stuff gets really kind of in the weeds, I would say, on the first part especially, but go ahead.
All right, I may skip over some of the technical stuff, but let's get the foundation here. The post-trial court conducted the hearing of this motion January 2024. During the hearing, the post-trial court asked each juror if the guilty verdict was an accurate statement about their verdict at the time, whether their verdict was based entirely on testimony, evidence, and law presented in the case, and whether they heard Becky Hill make any comment about the case before the verdict, and whether their verdict was influenced in any way by any communications by Hill. Juror X, not Malcolm X, just keeping the jurors anonymous here, who testified on the first day of the hearing, acknowledged hearing Becky Hill say before Murdaugh's testimony, "Looks like the defendant is going to testify. This is an important day," or "This is an epic day," and that it was rare. Becky Hill said it was rare for a defendant to testify. Juror X said these statements did not impact the verdict. I mean, I would say it was inappropriate for Becky Hill to make these statements, but I'm not sure how damaging they really are. Juror Z, who submitted one of the affidavits Murdaugh attached to his motion for a new trial, was the first juror to testify on the second hearing date. When asked whether she heard Hill make any comments about the case, Juror Z responded that Becky Hill said to watch his actions, Murdaugh's actions, and to watch Murdaugh closely. Juror Z added that Hill said more, but she could not remember anything else. Juror Z explained Hill's statements influenced her finding Murdaugh guilty because to me it felt like she, Becky Hill, made it seem like he was already guilty. That is egregious. At the state's request, the post-trial court questioned Juror Z about her affidavit, addressing each paragraph in turn. Juror Z's affidavit gave a more detailed recitation of Hill's comments. Now, quoting, I guess, from the affidavit, toward the end of the trial, after the President's Day break, but before Murdaugh testified, clerk of the court, Rebecca Hill, told the jury not to be fooled by the evidence presented by Murdaugh's defense attorneys, which I understood to mean that Murdaugh would lie when he testifies. Becky Hill also instructed the jury to watch him closely immediately before he testified, including to look at his actions and look at his movements, which I understood to mean he was guilty. So now we've contextualized those statements that otherwise might have been somewhat innocuous. Juror Z testified that when the jury began deliberations, Becky Hill told the jury, "This shouldn't take us long."
Us? Who's this us? Who's this we?
In addition, they're all on the same team, right? In addition to Team Murdaugh guilty of murder, in addition to referencing Becky Hill's statements, Juror Z averred in her affidavit, I had questions about Murdaugh's guilt, but voted guilty because I felt pressured by the other jurors.
See,
Women.
This was another huge problem in the exclusion of the egg lady, because like you see, here's some reasonable doubts that were raised by the defense. You need to have a unanimous jury. That was the defense juror that got that she manipulated right off the jury. I remember that when that happened at the time, and that was very damaging to the defense, because sometimes you put all your eggs into a basket of a juror. You're like, okay, here's my not guilty juror, or you got one or two on there that you're arguing to because it must be unanimous, and that there's some doubts there. And then all of a sudden, here's the clerk coming in, tainting those jurors, knocking off those probed, and she's back there listening. She knows who might have the doubts, and then she's impacted. It should have been a mistrial right there. I mean, but the judge trying to preserve. We spent so much. There's this sunk time fallacy.
Right. Yeah, it's I love when they live stream these high profile trials, of course, and I've covered a lot of them as they were live streamed. But there's something in the live stream that you can't get, that you can get when you're in the jury room, and that is you get to see the jury. You don't see that in a live stream. In the courtroom, you get to see the jury, and of course, the lawyers are watching the jurors, and they're watching their demeanors, and they're watching their reactions to certain arguments. And you can see often when you're getting traction with a particular juror, oh, she likes that argument. So then you'll start reinforcing that argument to get that juror's attention, because you only need one to not have your client be found guilty.
Oh, and there's some sophisticated lawyering you could do with that. I remember on voir dire setting it up, and you hear how they're answering. And then when you come to that issue that you set up in voir dire, you talk to the juror that brought it up. Okay, this, and you're speaking, asking a question, but you're looking at that juror, and you can call them out. Remember when you said that? I mean, it's very important because it's a communication, and these are your only opportunities as a defense to make your points, and you're making them to individuals and people, and you want to make a decision. You got some outside force coming in there, knocking off those jurors. That's not fair.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, people generally have a kind of an ego-driven desire to stay consistent, right? If they answered A the first time, they want to answer A the second time. And of course, you can use that behavioral characteristic to your advantage. All right, continuing here. After reviewing the affidavit, the post-trial court questioned Juror Z. This is the post-trial court judge now. I asked you previously, Juror Z, was your verdict on March 2nd, 2023 influenced in any way by communications from Becky Hill, the clerk of court? You answered that question, yes. In light of what you said in the affidavit, which is, I had questions about Murdaugh's guilt, but voted guilty because I felt pressured by the other jurors, is that answer that I just read a more accurate statement of how you felt? Juror Z answered affirmatively. Yes, the I was pressured is more accurate. The post-trial court then asked if she stood by the affidavit. She said yes. Juror Z subsequently submitted an affidavit to clarify her testimony, in which she explained that she felt influenced to find Murdaugh guilty by Hill's remarks before she entered the jury room. And once deliberations began, she felt additional pressure from the other jurors to reach a guilty verdict. Although the post-trial court did not admit this second affidavit, it accepted it as a proffer. Thus, the affidavit is part of the record before this court.
So Poot proffered it, which was good. And I'll say now that I'm rereading this, I remember that at the time, and I remember this is error. To proceed to trial with this in the record, it's error, and it's coming back on appeal. I remember this happening, and Poot, putting that affidavit in there. Yeah, that was error amongst other errors.
Because, of course, that makes a difference whether she was persuaded by other jurors, which is permissible, right? That's what deliberations is, or whether she was persuaded by a force outside the jury, which is not permissible. Juror P testified that on the day Murdaugh was to take the witness stand, Becky Hill made a comment to watch his body language. He denied the comment influenced him in any way. The remaining jurors testified that they did not hear Hill make any comments about the case, and they were not influenced by any comments she made. Following the jurors' testimony, the state called Becky Hill as a witness. Although Hill denied making most of the comments the jurors related, she admitted that on the day Murdaugh testified, and within earshot of some jurors, she spoke to the bailiff about Murdaugh's decision to testify. I wasn't talking to the jury. They must have just overheard me. She also stated that she gave the jurors a little talk, instructing them to pay attention and that the day was a big day. She denied attempting to influence the jury, and then we get to it. In discussing her book, Behind the Doors of Justice, The Murdaugh Murders, Becky Hill claimed literary license to explain some of the more dramatic passages. She denied wanting a guilty verdict because it would sell more books, claiming the outcome of the trial did not matter to her. But she acknowledged as true a passage in which she stated she believed Murdaugh was guilty, but was concerned he would be acquitted because of his family's goodwill in the community. I don't think the Murdaugh family had much goodwill.
Footnotes. I think those 2 footnotes are pretty good.
All right, let's hit them. Following Jersey's testimony, the post-trial court informed the parties that the other jurors who were waiting for their turn to testify had tuned in to the proceeding on court TV. The jurors either denied viewing the proceeding or if they saw it, asserted it would not influence their testimony. That's the age we live in, isn't it?
Yeah.
People can't help themselves. As her book's title suggests, Behind the Doors of Justice, it turns out Becky Hill was quite busy behind the doors of justice, thwarting the integrity of the justice system she was sworn to protect and uphold. The book was pulled from publication because Hill plagiarized portions of it. Unbelievable. Trash.
Unbelievable, yeah.
The post-trial court also questioned Hill about the Go ahead, Steve.
But I was just going to say, just from experience, I mean, I've done thousands and thousands of criminal cases, right? I'm just, clerks should not be interacting with the jury this way. Nobody should be interacting with the jury. You've got a bailiff who's in charge of the jury, and they should be shooing away anybody like this. What is she doing? Hovering around the jury. I mean, I don't understand this at all. To me, I mean, it doesn't comport with the way I have seen trials conducted, at least in Florida, in my experience. Now, maybe it's because it's a super small town and they're short-staffed or whatever, but there's a bailiff in charge, and the bailiff shouldn't make comments either.
Indeed. The jurors should hardly know who these people are. Any interaction they have should be purely administrative, right? Here's the jury room. What would you like for lunch? That kind of stuff. Nothing to do with the case. The post-trial court also questioned Hill about the favors she granted the media. Becky Hill denied allowing the press to view the exhibits, including the sealed exhibits. However, she subsequently pled guilty to perjury stemming from this denial. Although the post-trial court limited discussion of juror 785, what's that footnote? Oh, it's the egg lady. When the trial court dismissed juror 785, she said her belongings left in the jury room included a dozen eggs, which another juror had brought her. She then became known as the egg juror or egg lady. Oh, she didn't even bring the eggs herself. Somebody else brought the eggs and gave them to her.
Right,
crazy. Although the post-trial court limited discussion of juror 785, the egg lady, whom the trial court dismissed on the day deliberations began, after the trial, after closing arguments, for allegedly discussing the case with third parties, it allowed Murdaugh to question Becky Hill about bringing to the trial court's attention social media posts that Hill mistakenly believed were from the egg lady's ex-husband. Becky Hill claimed the juror was very talkative while Becky Hill walked her to the trial court's chambers and volunteered that there were restraining orders on her ex-husband when they divorced. In response to the post-trial court's questioning, Becky Hill continued to deny initiating or engaging the juror in discussion of these matters. But in contrast to Becky Hill's self-serving testimony, the egg lady averred at the hearing before the trial court and in an affidavit Murdaugh attached to his motion for a new trial that Becky Hill interrogated her about the social media posts and whether she had been in contact with her ex-husband. Completely inappropriate for a clerk to be doing this. In the affidavit, the egg lady related that Becky Hill, knowing the juror's fears about her ex-husband, informed her that law enforcement officers questioned the ex-husband about the social media post, offered to reinstate the restraining orders the egg lady had against him, and speculated that the Murdaughs probably got to the ex-husband when he called the egg lady on the morning of the verdict. The egg lady asserted Becky Hill asked her whether she and the other jurors were inclined to vote guilty or not, and told her that everything Murdaugh said had been lies. She also stated that before Murdaugh testified, Becky Hill told the jurors to not be fooled by the evidence defense attorneys presented. And who's more credible here? The juror who really has nothing substantive to do with this case, or Becky Hill selling her book?
And if you remember, I remember this one too, and I remember this also being error at the time, and that was because this was a favored juror by the defense, and they were being tampered with in order to disqualify them. And then what happened was, and I remember this testimony, it's like the juror came in and said, this is not, there was not a reason, but the judge is like, well, in the abundance of caution, I'm going to dismiss this juror. And that was the defense juror. And it was so this is jury tampering. And you say that the clerk nobody should be tampering with the jury this way. And for the clerk to do it is even worse. It's even worse because they're a government employee. It's like, but these jurors should be isolated and protected, and instead they're being manipulated and tampered with. This is really bad.
And of course, they're susceptible to manipulation because they're lay people. They don't know how any of this is supposed to run. They don't know if the clerk's acting appropriately. They've likely never been on a jury before. Okay. Rhonda McElveen, the Barnwell County Clerk of Court, who assisted Becky Hill with the trial, testified that Becky Hill repeatedly told her she wanted to write a book so she could buy a lake house. And a guilty verdict would be the best way to sell books.
Can we both as authors say that that's not happening?
It's very rare to make any money off a book. McElveen testified that after hearing Becky Hill had given a juror a ride home, oh my God, McElveen counseled her that it was inappropriate. And while Hill admitted she gave the juror a ride, she claimed the bailiff was with them and they did not discuss the case. What's that footnote? At the hearing, Hill denied giving a juror a ride home. Although the clerk from the other county, McElveen, did not hear Hill say anything inappropriate to jurors, she stated that Hill made comments to her, staff, and media members strikingly similar to those Juror Z reported, such as advising them not to be fooled by Murdaugh's attorneys and to look at Murdaugh's inactions and movements while he testified. Finally, McElveen testified that Becky Hill seated a writer with court personnel. This writer wrote the foreword for Hill's book. Quid pro quo. Next, Murdaugh called the alternate juror to testify. She described the incident in which Hill made her comments before Murdaugh put up his case, stating that while the jurors were assembled in one of the two jury rooms or were standing in the hall, Becky Hill stood at the doorway and told them, quote, they're going to say things that will try to confuse you, talking about the defense here. Don't let the defense confuse you or convince you or throw you off. The alternate juror also testified that Hill told the jurors not to be nervous and don't be afraid to show your emotions because that's what they want to see. Who's they? The alternate juror related she heard a court staff member say deliberations should not take long, but she could not remember who said it. In its order, the post-trial court declared the burden was on Murdaugh to show both an external influence on the jury and prejudice from that influence. It then found that Becky Hill made improper comments to the jurors on the day Murdaugh testified. The quote, this is an important day, and quote, this is an epic day,
okay, so
and that they should watch Murdaugh's body language.
So let's stop here for a second and think about, okay, what we're doing. First of all, I'm going to have to leave here in a few minutes, but
okay.
But I do want to talk about how to read an appellate opinion and what we're looking at here and what you've just done, okay, which is you have just read through the facts that are before the court related to the juror misconduct and the tampering with the jury, okay? So this is a fact portion. So now you're going to have law, and you're going to say, okay, so what is the relevant facts? Here's the relevant facts, and those are coming directly from transcripts and proffers that were done by the defense team, okay? And then that's laid out as fact. This is factual, or at least these are what the allegations are. Now what we're going to do is there's something called IRAC, Issue Rule Analysis Conclusion, that lawyers learn in writing and analysis. So what is the issue that's raised by these comments to the jury? Well, the issue is whether or not these comments by the clerk to the jury, specific comments that are laid out in the factual part, are sufficient to grant a new trial. All right, so then that's the issue. Well, what's the rule? Now we're transitioning from the fact part. We're going to look at what South Carolina's courts have established as rules to apply to these facts. So now we have the issues, we have the rule we're going to apply. That's I is the issue, rule, analysis is the A. And the analysis, what you do is you integrate that rule with those facts. So you say, okay, there's a 3-part test, and there's always a 3-part test, right? Mm-hmm. There's a 3-part test, and it's this, and then you integrate those facts in both sides to see whether or not those tests are met. And then you have an analysis, that's the analysis part, and then you have a conclusion. In this case, these facts create a situation that requires a new trial because they rose to the level of injustice. So that's the way that this appellate court should read, and I think that this does read that way. So you had an initial introduction, but this is the way that the law works, and this is the way the common law is created. So, you can't write a law ahead of time that says anytime a clerk says to pay extra attention to the defendant when he testifies, that's a reason for trial. You can't write that specifically. So you create general rules, general statutes, general propositions that are they're legal, what we call black letter rules, right, or black letter law. And then say, now I'm going to pick this rule, and then I'm going to apply it to this specific fact pattern, and then that's going to create an outcome. And the common law is that over time that generates a set of kind of ideas that should approach rationality. This is very kind of jurisprudence, but it's interesting because we're seeing it here demonstrated by the Supreme Court of South Carolina. And so now what we're going to get into is what rule are they going to apply? So let's talk about the rules. And then you're going to get into another section which says, okay, let's apply those rules to the fact pattern at hand.
Right. And here, of course, the rule, as they say, is 1, was there an external influence? Did Becky Hill make these comments? And 2, did it matter? Did it actually influence the outcome? And then, of course, who bears the burden of making that argument? In this case, it's the defendant, Murdaugh. Do you need to go now, Steve, or can you?
I've got about 15 more minutes. I'll put in a plug, though. If I am doing criminal law again in South Florida, and my firm is a general practice firm, so I can refer you within the firm. So if you do have a South Florida legal matter that you need help with, then give me a call. I'd be happy to talk to you and refer you to within our firm. It's
you have a link for that?
It's glantzlaw.com, GLANTZ law.com. Nice firm out of Plantation, Florida. And it's interesting. I'm kind of back in my wheelhouse doing criminal law, which after a 2-year diversion of civil, I'm kind of back in my wheelhouse. So it's funny, just sharing a little personal side because I'm going to be leaving soon. But, I've done death penalty work in front of the Florida Supreme Court. I mean, I've been argued about 5 times for the Florida Supreme Court. I don't know how many death cases I've argued, but anyways, long story short, I'm doing these high level things. And so it's like, oh, okay, I know what to do in that. And then I get like, okay, we want you to handle a traffic ticket. And I'm like, how do I do that? So it's funny that the challenges of being in private practice like this are, my challenge is not these big cases, it's the little tiny cases, but I do little tiny cases too. So anyway.
Is there a URL for Glantz Law that you'd want to point people to?
Yeah, it would be glancelaw.com. I mean, I think it's, but you can look me up on the Florida Supreme Court website as a lawyer, and it'll give you my phone number there. So yeah, we cover basically South Florida and all across South Florida. You know, it's a big community: Miami, Broward, Palm Beach, Collier, Lee County, all that sort of Central Florida down, right?
All right, I put the link in the comments, folks. Glancelaw.com.
And if you want to buy books, I guess you can go there or go to what is it? The Amazon. You know, in fact, we talked about this. We need to do that death penalty show that you talked about. Now that I'm unleashed on the internet yet again.
I would love to.
Great to see you.
What was that case again?
I don't know. Was it the Charlie Kirk murder case?
Yeah, I think it was that one.
Right, yeah, well, you were saying there's a lot of, because I'm Catholic and I'm very anti-death penalty for a number of reasons, but I understand, and I've written a book on the death penalty pros and cons, you know, summarizing all the arguments. People like to argue disingenuously. They straw man the other side's arguments. And so I don't like doing that. I like to steel man the other side's arguments. Okay, what are the best arguments for and what are the best arguments against? And try to look at it objectively. And so that's what my book, Death Penalty Debates, does, is it lays out all the best arguments for, all the best arguments against, and then empowers you to make your own mind up, as opposed to telling you let me tell you what I think, right? And I've also welcomed people to, if they have a differing position, and I haven't included their favorite argument, to email me and I'll modify it and put it in the book. Because I've tried to, what happened was, you know, I have so much experience in this area, and I'd tell people, I did death penalty work. They say, well, let me tell you what I think about it. And then they proceed to tell me their arguments, right? And they didn't really want to hear what I had to say. So I was like, okay. So I just started listening and cataloging the arguments. And that's what came out. And I think it's one of my better books. Probably my two good books, or amongst the ones, or the two that are sort of prominent, are Death Penalty Debates, which is that. And then the other book, which we talked about, Individual Freedom, which is called Freedom, Faith, and Truth. Which is a summary of kind of my philosophy. So thank you for the plugs. I get to plug again.
Of course.
But so anyway, we're introducing Iraq and what's forthcoming here. I'll stay for a little bit longer. I can stay for a little bit longer.
Okay. The post-trial court determined that Becky Hill's denial of making these statements was not credible, finding that Becky Hill wanted to write a book, which she believed a guilty verdict would help sell. She was attracted by the siren call of celebrity, and she allowed her desire for the public attention of the moment to overcome her duty to her oath of office and her oath as a witness. Next, the post-trial court found that these comments did not affect any juror's verdict. It explained that Juror Z's assertions that Becky Hill's comments affected her verdict were ambivalent, self-contradictory, and not credible, emphasizing that Juror Z had acknowledged her statement in her affidavit that she had voted guilty due to pressure from other jurors was the more accurate statement. And of course, that's permissible. Persuasion by other members of the jury is permissible. The post-trial court further found that Becky Hill's comments were limited in subject and not overt as to opinion, were only heard by at most 3 jurors, well, that's plenty, and were made in a case with overwhelming and compelling evidence.
Well,
I keep hearing people say that. I keep seeing these comments on social media. The evidence against Murdaugh was overwhelmingly in favor of guilt. I'm like, not to this lawyer's eyes, and I actually watched the trial.
I watched the whole trial too, and it was at best confused. I thought there was unexplained exculpatory evidence. There was no direct evidence. It was a circumstantial case, and I couldn't come up with a motive. In fact, it was contradictory to the motive. I have a lot of problems, and I remember the judge making that comment, and I was like, really? At the time he made that comment, I didn't see that at all. I mean, there was overwhelming evidence of guilt that he was a fraudster and that he was a liar and that he was a thief and that he was a bad guy, but not that he was a murderer. And that's the key distinction.
That judge thought the case was overwhelming, compelling evidence, and the trial court's extensive instructions cured any effect from these comments. Yeah, instructions don't really cure anything.
Okay, jurors, don't ignore the elephant in the room.
You will disregard that testimony. The post-trial court concluded that while it found Murdaugh had failed to meet its burden to prove prejudice, any presumption of prejudice was overcome. It therefore denied Murdaugh's motion for a new trial. Murdaugh timely appealed to the Court of Appeals. This South Carolina Supreme Court certified the appeal of the denial of the motion for a new trial and subsequently consolidated it with a direct appeal. That's a bunch of administrative stuff. The Remmer presumption of prejudice. Murdaugh, his lawyers actually, of course, Harpootlian, argues that he was denied his constitutional right to a fair trial by an impartial jury free from outside influence. He asserts that following Remmer v. United States, referred to now as Remmer 1, prejudice should be presumed from Hill's comments to the jury, and the presumption is irrebuttable. In the alternative, he contends that the state failed to rebut the presumption of prejudice, even if it is a rebuttable presumption.
So a couple points here, and this is very interesting here. Remmer is a U.S. Supreme Court case, not a Supreme Court of South Carolina case. So this is federal law and talking about fair trial, impartial jury. Second is, and this presumption is very important. This is the kind of thing that appellate lawyers geek out on, but it's important because I think that even in the alternative here, this is where the judge, I think, should have granted it, because the state never rebutted the presumption. So who bears the burden? Like, is the defense team, do they have to show prejudice, or does the state have to show it didn't cause prejudice? And right. If the state has to show it didn't cause prejudice, they didn't do that. And for the judge to find that they did, I think was error. It did not follow the rules. So this is the first rule that they're coming out with is U.S. Supreme Court Remmer. So I just wanted to chime in here with the rule.
Yep. Okay, let me pull it back up. Let's see. The state argues that the jury convicted Murdaugh because he was obviously guilty, not to my eye, and not because 3 jurors heard Hill's foolish and fleeting comments about his upcoming testimony. It contends that the post-trial court correctly declined to presume prejudice, and any presumption of prejudice was rebuttable, and I guess they would say they rebutted it. We, the Supreme Court of South Carolina, agree with Murdaugh. There's the money shot right there. Prejudice is presumed from Hill's comments, and while this presumption is rebuttable, the state failed to overcome this presumption. Our federal and state constitutions guarantee a criminal defendant the right to a fair trial by an impartial jury. No right touches more to the heart of fairness in a trial than the right to an impartial jury. This right can be infringed when a third party makes improper contact with the jury. For the right is meaningful only if the jury remains free from outside influence, including exposure or information that has not been introduced during the trial. In fact, that's a core function of a criminal court, is to act as a gatekeeper on the evidence and the arguments that the jury is allowed to hear. To protect the right to an impartial jury in such cases, the Supreme Court of the United States created a rebuttable presumption of prejudice, the Remmer presumption, elucidating, U.S. Supreme Court now, quote, any private communication, contact, or tampering directly or indirectly with the juror during a trial about the matter pending before the jury is, for obvious reasons, deemed presumptively prejudicial, if not made in pursuance of known rules of the court and the instructions and directions of the court made during the trial with full knowledge of the parties. The presumption is not conclusive, but the burden rests heavily upon the government to establish, after notice to and hearing of the defendant, that such conduct with the juror was harmless to the defendant. The United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit noted that in addition to the presumption of prejudice, Remmer established a separate but related requirement that a defendant be entitled to a hearing when the defendant presents a credible allegation of communications or contact between a third party and a juror concerning the matter pending before the jury. The Fourth Circuit established a 3-step test. Here's your 3 steps, Steve.
It's always 3, and there's a reason for that, and it's because if you have a 4-part test, some academic will say, well, really, elements 3 and 4 are the same one, right?
Right.
And then they say, and if it's a 2-part test, they say, oh, that's too simple. So it's always a 3-part test. This is like degenerated. So it's always, it's a cliche, but it's true.
Let's see, quoting the Fourth Circuit here, the party who's attacking the verdict bears the initial burden of introducing competent evidence that the extrajudicial communications or contacts were more than innocuous interventions. If this minimal standard is satisfied, the Remmer 1 presumption is triggered automatically. The burden then shifts to the prevailing party, here the state, to prove that there exists no reasonable possibility that the juror's verdict was influenced by an improper communication. The Fourth Circuit further provided that in determining whether the extrajudicial contact was innocuous or whether it triggered the presumption of influence, the court considers whether there was 1, any private communication, 2, any private contact, 3, any tampering, 4, directly or indirectly with the juror during trial, 5, about the matter before the jury. Well, there are 5 elements there, Steve. An unauthorized contact between a third party and a juror concerns the matter.
Those aren't elements. No, wait a second. You got to be confused. Those aren't elements. Those are
other alternatives.
Those are factors.
Okay, so factors. Right.
They have an exclusive list of factors within one of the elements. So it's like when determining what are the elements or what are the factors that are to be considered to determine? Well, here are some possible factors. That's what that is.
Right. Fair enough. An unauthorized contact between a third party and a juror concerns the matter pending before the jury when it's of such a character as to reasonably draw into question the integrity of the verdict. Once the Remmer presumption is triggered, the state bears the heavy burden of proving that there is no reasonable possibility that the verdict was affected by the contact. The court must examine the entire picture, including the factual circumstances and the impact on the juror. Now they're quoting from, I guess, a second Remmer case, Remmer 2. In determining whether the state met its burden of rebutting the Remmer presumption, courts consider a variety of factors, as the extent of improper communication, the extent to which the communication was discussed and considered by the jury, the type of information communicated, the timing of the exposure, and the strength of the state's case. The extent of the communication is the most important factor. In Parker v. Gladden, the Supreme Court recognized the extreme prejudice inherent in statements concerning the matter at trial when made by an officer of the court. There, a bailiff who oversaw a sequestered jury during an 8-day trial stated to a jury in the presence of other jurors, "Oh, that wicked fellow, he is guilty."
Yeah, and see, most of the juror tampering cases come from bailiffs because usually the bailiffs are in charge of the jury, and so it's a little odd. Hey, I got to step away. It's great.
All right, man. You. And, thanks so much, buddy.
Good to see you, and I'll catch up. Hopefully, we'll do it again soon. And thank you to chat. I see my friends Slidey Pie and Jacob, all of my good folks over on my stream. So Bella the Bayou. And so anyways, God bless you all. Thanks for being, and pay attention to this guy. He knows what he's talking about.
Take care, brother.
Bye-bye.
All right. It's always nice to have Steve on sharing his lengthy and deep expertise on all matters legal. All right. Continuing here. The bailiff also told another juror, if there's anything wrong in finding the petitioner guilty, the Supreme Court will correct it. So don't worry, just vote guilty. It'll get fixed later. You know, on appeal, where there's a 0.6% chance of meaningful relief, at least one juror or alternate overheard the statements. In rejecting the state's argument that no prejudice in that case was shown, the Supreme Court explained, quote, this argument overlooks the fact that the official character of the bailiff as an officer of the court, as well as of the state, beyond question carries great weight with the jury that he had been shepherding for 8 days and nights. Although the Supreme Court noted the 26-hour jury deliberations and one juror's testimony she was prejudiced also supported the trial court's finding of prejudice, it held that the unauthorized conduct of the bailiff involves such a probability of prejudice will result that it is deemed inherently lacking in due process. It further recognized that it would be blinking reality not to recognize the extreme prejudice inherent in such statements that reached at least 3 members of the jury and an alternate jury member. However, not all comments by officers of the court are prejudicial. In the case of Green, this would be a South Carolina Supreme Court decision, a juror asked a bailiff what would happen in the event of a deadlock, and he responded the judge would likely give them an Allen charge and ask if they could stay later. An Allen charge is just, I know you're stumped, jury, but I want you to go back and try again. While the Court of Appeals held the state overcame the Remmer presumption, this Supreme Court held the bailiff's comments did not trigger the presumption of influence. We explained that our unwillingness to categorically apply the Remmer presumption of prejudice stems from our view that not every inappropriate comment by a bailiff to a juror rises to the level of constitutional error. As the Fourth Circuit recognized, there is a split among the circuits regarding the issue, whether the Remmer presumption has survived intact following a later Supreme Court decision, some 40 years later, the Supreme Court decision in Smith v. Phillips. In Phillips, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to impute bias to a juror who applied for a job in the prosecutor's office during the defendant's trial. In reversing the grant of federal habeas relief by a lower district court, the Supreme Court declared that the remedy for allegations of juror partiality is a hearing in which the defendant has the opportunity to prove actual bias. The court explained that due process does not require a new trial every time a juror has been placed in a potentially compromising situation. Instead, due process necessitates a jury capable and willing to decide the case solely on the evidence before it, and a trial judge ever watchful to prevent prejudicial occurrences and to determine the effect of such occurrences when they happen. In the case of Olano, the Supreme Court considered whether the presence of alternate jurors during jury deliberations was a plain error that the Court of Appeals was authorized to correct under the Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure, noting that alternate jurors' presence was not the type of error that affected the substantial rights independent of its prejudicial impact. The Supreme Court found no reason to presume prejudice from alternate jurors being present during deliberations. It explained there may be cases where an intrusion should be presumed prejudicial, but a presumption of prejudice, as opposed to a specific analysis, does not change the ultimate question. Did the intrusion actually affect the jury's deliberations and thereby its verdict? Let's see. I'm going to skip past some of this history and get to something of substance here. Let me see. Lots of this stuff is in the weeds. We clarified today that when faced with a third party's improper contact with a juror, our courts should follow the Fourth Circuit's 3-step analysis as set forth in the case of Cheek and 1. Require the defendant to meet the initial burden by presenting evidence that contacts were more than innocuous interventions. 2, if this minimal standard is satisfied, recognize the Remmer presumption of undue influence is triggered automatically. And 3, shift the burden to the prevailing party, in this case the state, to prove there exists no reasonable possibility that the jury's verdict was influenced by an improper communication. Under this framework, we turn to the facts at hand. First, we determine which comments Hill made to the jurors. The post-trial court referenced only a few of the comments the jurors testified she made. For example, this is an important day, or this is an epic day, and to watch Murdaugh's body language. The state argues the post-trial court implicitly rejected other alleged comments as not being credible. We find this argument is without merit. The post-trial court gave no indication it found the other comments not credible, nor would the record support such a finding. Indeed, the post-trial court found Becky Hill's denial of making any inappropriate comments, her denial lacked credibility. The post-trial court made no distinction regarding the comments it referenced in its order and the remaining comments that are in the record. The post-trial court, in fact, found credible Juror Z's affidavit statement concerning pressure from other jurors. This same affidavit included Juror Z's recollection of Hill's comments not to be fooled by the defense evidence, and Hill's instructions to watch Murdaugh closely, look at his actions, and look at his movements. The state offers no rationale for finding part of the affidavit credible while rejecting the portions that are damaging to the state's case. Juror Z's recollection of Hill's comments was consistent with the Egg Lady's affidavit testimony that Hill told the jurors not to be fooled by the evidence Murdaugh's defense presented. And Juror Z's recollection is also consistent with the alternate juror's testimony concerning Hill's comments. Quote, "They're going to say things that will try to confuse you. Don't let them confuse you or convince you or throw you off." Footnote 11. Let's take a look at this. Oh, it's not much. These comments were also strikingly similar to the comments Hill made to the neighboring county clerk who came in to help with the trial, McElveen, other staff members, and the media went away from the jury. Furthermore, Becky Hill's attempt to insert herself into the jury deliberations through these comments was in line with her stated desire for a guilty verdict to sell more copies of the book she planned to write. Her meddling in events around the Egg Lady juror's dismissal and her self-aggrandizing conduct throughout and after the trial, from granting favors to media members, such as allowing them to view sealed exhibits, and sitting a writer with court staff in the courtroom to granting interviews. As the post-trial court found, Hill was attracted by the siren call of celebrity and allowed her desire for the public attention of the moment to overcome her duty to her oath of office. We, the Supreme Court of South Carolina, have no reason to find that Hill did not make all of the statements the jurors reported. Therefore, we hold that Murdaugh established Becky Hill made comments that the day Murdaugh testified was epic or important and urged jurors not to be fooled, confused, thrown off, or convinced by Murdaugh, and to watch Murdaugh's body language closely. Next, we must decide whether those comments were more than innocuous interventions. This is step 2 of Cheek. And of such a character as to reasonably draw into question the integrity of the verdict. Becky Hill's statements were more comparable to those of the bailiff in Parker than of the bailiff in Green. Like the bailiff's statements in Parker, Hill's comments attacked the defendant's character and credibility, which certainly were matters before the jury. "Oh, that wicked fellow, the defendant, he is guilty." Hill became a character witness on behalf of the state, encouraging the jurors to question Murdaugh's credibility. In fact, by urging the jurors not to be fooled or convinced by Murdaugh's defense, Hill essentially implored the jurors to find him guilty, the ultimate issue in the case. Even Hill's seemingly innocuous comments that the day Murdaugh testified was an epic or important day became nefarious when considered in the context of her other comments, insinuating that there was something unusual and suspicious about his decision to testify. In contrast, the bailiff's statements in Green, though improper, did not touch the merits, but dealt only with the procedural question of how the judge might handle a jury impasse that apparently never materialized, the question about the Allen charge. Therefore, we, the Supreme Court of South Carolina, hold that Murdaugh met the minimal standard of showing that the extrajudicial communications of contacts were more than merely innocuous interventions, and the post-trial court committed error as a matter of law in refusing to impose the Remmer presumption of undue influence. Our following consideration is whether the state met its heavy burden of proving that there's no reasonable possibility the verdict was affected by Hill's comments. That's the third and final factor in the Cheek decision. As stated above, the post-trial court analyzed the evidence before it by erroneously imposing the burden of proof of prejudice on Murdaugh. Furthermore, as Murdaugh argues, the post-trial court committed error in considering testimony from the jurors about whether Hill's comments affected their verdict because this testimony violated Rule 606B of the South Carolina Rules of Evidence. Rule 606B limits the testimony of a juror may give on the issue of prejudice. This rule provides that upon an inquiry into validity of a verdict or indictment, a juror may not testify as to any matter or statement occurring during the course of the jury's deliberations or to the effect of anything upon that or any other juror's minds or emotions as influencing the juror to assent or dissent from the verdict or indictment or concerning the juror's mental processes in connection with a verdict or indictment, except that a juror may testify on the question whether extraneous prejudicial information was improperly brought to the jury's attention or whether any outside influence was improperly brought to bear upon any juror. Nor may a juror's affidavit or evidence of any statement by the juror concerning a matter about which the juror would be precluded from testifying be received for these purposes. So the jurors are allowed to testify about what happened. Was there this communication? What was the communication? But they're not allowed to testify about what influence that communication had on them. The matter of influence is going to be judged by people who are not the jurors. The United States Supreme Court explained the federal version of this rule, which is essentially the same, is grounded in the common law rule against admission of jury testimony to impeach a verdict and the exception for jury testimony relating to an extraneous influence. United States Supreme Court, case of Tanner. In Tanner, the U.S. Supreme Court examined the history of that rule. Public policy requires a finality to litigation, and common fairness requires that absolute privacy be preserved for jurors to engage in the full and free debate necessary to the attainment of just verdicts. Jurors will not be able to function effectively if their deliberations are to be scrutinized in post-trial litigation. In the interest of protecting the jury system and the citizens who make it work, Rule 606 should not permit any inquiry into the internal deliberations of the jurors. The Supreme Court noted its holding requiring an evidentiary hearing where extrinsic influence or relationships have tainted the deliberations do not detract from, but rather harmonize with the weighty government interest in insulating the jury's deliberative process. Thus, while a probing factual inquiry is not only permissible but necessary when a third party makes extrajudicial contact with the juror, the rule prohibits all inquiry into a juror's mental process in connection with the verdict. The Fourth Circuit noted that by asking a juror whether he had listened to and considered all the evidence, the government was delving into the juror's mental processes about the sufficiency of the evidence in reaching his personal verdict. Such an inquiry exceeded the strict limits imposed by Rule 606. It further held that the federal district trial court committed error by relying on the juror's mental processes in connection with the verdict when formulating its findings of fact. We find that the plain language of Rule 606 authorizes the jurors to testify about improper extraneous comments by a third party, but not on the comments' effects on the jurors' deliberations. The state contends that Murdaugh cannot complain about the post-trial court questioning of Juror Z regarding her affidavit because Murdaugh submitted the affidavit to the post-trial court with his motion for a new trial. We disagree. The purpose of Rule 606 is to preserve the sanctity of the jury room, protecting the jury system and the citizens who make it work. This right was not Murdaugh's to waive. Thus, the portion of Juror Z's affidavit in which she disclosed her mental processes in reaching her verdict was inadmissible. The post-trial court committed error in questioning her about that portion of the affidavit, and the post-trial court should not have considered that portion in ruling on the new trial motion. We also hold the post-trial court committed error in finding a lack of prejudice because Hill's comments were limited in subject and not overt as to opinion, were only heard by at most 3 jurors, and were made in a case with overwhelming and compelling evidence. We, the Supreme Court of South Carolina, reiterate the burden is on the state to rebut the presumption of prejudice. First, the post-trial court committed error in finding Hill's comments were limited in subject and not overt as to opinion. Hill clearly advised the jurors to find Murdaugh and the evidence he presented is not credible, and essentially urged them to render a guilty verdict. Hill's position as the Colleton County Clerk of Court, an officer of the court who managed the trial and was the primary caretaker of the jury, amplified the impact Becky Hill's comments had on the jury. Hill was elected by the very people who make up the Colleton County jury pool. Next, the limited number of jurors who acknowledged hearing Becky Hill's improper comments did not reduce their prejudicial effect. As the Supreme Court explained, a criminal defendant is entitled to be tried by 12, not 9 or even 10 impartial and unprejudiced jurors. In addition, in the context of a jury tainted by external influences, the strength of the state's case does not necessarily warrant a finding that the state met its burden of proving a lack of prejudice. The state certainly produced considerable evidence here, and arguably reasonable minds may debate whether the evidence here was overwhelming. In the situation before us, notwithstanding the strength, quote unquote, of the prosecution's case, the state is unable to overcome the presumption of prejudice. The state's case rested largely on circumstantial evidence, and Murdaugh's credibility was a key component of his defense. Becky Hill's repeated comments challenging Murdaugh's credibility directly undermined that defense. Becky Hill's egregious, improper jury interference went to the heart of the case and unquestionably was intended to push the jury to a guilty verdict. The breathtaking and disgraceful effort of Becky Hill to undermine the jury process is unprecedented in South Carolina. By the way, she ended up getting sentenced to 3 months probation for all this. In my view, Becky Hill should have faced the punishment she tried to railroad the defendant into: life in prison. Finally, writes the Supreme Court of South Carolina, we hold the state has not met its burden of proving the trial court's instructions to the jury cured any prejudice arising from Becky Hill's comments. Generally, an instruction to disregard incompetent evidence is deemed to have cured the incompetent evidence, that it was admitted. Moreover, jurors are presumed to follow the instructions. Here, the trial court gave the standard instructions and admonishments to the jury, none of which provided guidance on what to do when the Colleton County Clerk of Court, an officer of the court, made comments disparaging Murdaugh's credibility and urging the jury to reject his defense. The trial court never had the opportunity to even attempt to cure the prejudicial effect of Hill's comments because they did not come to light until months after the trial. If we were to accept the proposition that standard charges could cure such prejudice, then no defendant would be entitled to relief when improper, extrajudicial information reaches the jury's ears, regardless of its content or context. Our federal and state constitution simply cannot countenance such an assault on the right to a fair and impartial jury. In summation, Murdaugh met his initial burden of establishing Hill's comments to the jury were more than innocuous interventions, step 1 of the analysis, triggering the Remmer presumption of prejudice and shifting the burden of proof to the state. The state simply was unable to meet this heavy burden of proving that there exists no reasonable possibility that the jury's verdict was influenced by these highly improper comments, the second step of the analysis. Accordingly, we hold Murdaugh's right to a fair trial by an impartial jury was violated, and the post-trial court committed error in denying his motion for a new trial. All right, evidence of Murdaugh's financial crimes. Now, Steve read this already. He mentioned earlier when he was here. And he says this was not really compelling. Let's see what they have to say about it. If it's not compelling, let's see what they have to say here. So what they're recounting here is that there were like a week or two of testimony outside the hearing of the jury. It was almost like a lengthy pretrial hearing, but it took place in the midst of the trial about all this financial misconduct evidence. And then the judge decided that it should be admissible and the jury should get to hear it. The trial court found the evidence of other crimes is admissible and its non-propensity, as it does not suggest to the jury that the defendant had a tendency to commit murder. I specifically find these other crimes will not lure the jury into declaring guilt on a different ground than the specific charge. So he said this week's of financial misconduct testimony, which was horrific. I mean, not only was Murdaugh stealing from his fellow lawyers, he was stealing from clients. He was stealing from clients who were desperately handicapped and needed that money so he could pay for his drug habit. I mean, it was terrible. So then the state, in front of the jury, presented testimony to the jury from the 8 witnesses who testified earlier outside the hearing of the jury, along with 2 additional witnesses. Through these witnesses, the state proved Murdaugh committed wide-ranging financial crimes over numerous years in several categories, including Murdaugh stole money from his clients by billing personal expenses to them under the guise of those expenses being costs associated with their cases. Murdaugh stole money from his law firm by instructing law firm employees to make checks payable to Palmetto State Bank, whose then chief executive officer, who would get fired, Russell Lafitte, enabled Murdaugh to convert the funds for his personal use. Murdaugh stole money from his clients and his law firm by instructing law firm employees to make checks payable to Forge, a fake account Murdaugh created to imitate the legitimate Forge consulting firm that Murdaugh then deposited and used for personal expenses. Murdaugh stole money from Tony Satterfield by filing an insurance claim in relation to his mother, Gloria Satterfield's death, and collected the insurance proceeds for personal use instead of providing the proceeds to Tony and Gloria's other son. The state also presented evidence to the jury that Murdaugh's years of stealing money in these ways was about to be exposed. Let's see. Murdaugh challenges the admissibility of evidence of his financial crimes under Rules 401, 402, 403, and 404. 401 says relevant evidence means evidence having any tendency to make the existence of any fact that is of consequence to the determination of the action, so a fact that can help the jury answer the legal question, more probable or less probable. That's what probative means. Rule 402, all relevant evidence is admissible except as otherwise provided. Rule 403, evidence may be excluded if its probative value, its useful value, is substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. And Rule 404, evidence of other crimes, wrongs, or acts is not admissible to prove the character of a person in order to show action in conformity therewith. It may, however, be admissible to show motive. As to Murdaugh's relevance objections, the state argues that because Murdaugh was charged with murdering his wife and son and seemingly inexplicable conduct when standing alone, it was important that it offer evidence to explain why he did it, motive. The state argues Murdaugh himself placed the issue of motive front and center through his own actions by suggesting to officers who arrived at the farm on June 7th that the killer's motive stemmed from the boat wreck. That would be the wreck his son was involved in, the son who was killed, the boat wreck that resulted in the death of a young girl, a young woman who was on the boat. And there's evidence the son was drunk at the time. So basically a DUI homicide. We agree with the state that evidence of Murdaugh's financial crimes made the state's theory of motive more probable. So it's probative. So we find the trial court acted within its discretion in finding the financial crimes evidence was relevant under Rule 401, that it was probative, and admissible under Rule 402, which was, again, all relevant evidence is admissible unless otherwise provided. The Supreme Court continues, the more difficult question is whether the trial court should have excluded all or some of the financial crimes pursuant to Rule 404, propensity evidence, which is inadmissible, that the person has a propensity to commit a crime, or Rule 403, that the prejudicial value outweighs the probative value. We address this question as two distinct categories of issues. The first of these categories, whether the trial court should have excluded all the financial crimes evidence, is a point on which not all members of this South Carolina Supreme Court would have ruled the same way had we been on the trial court. We each agree, however, that this was a decision within the discretion of the trial court under the facts and circumstances that existed in Murdaugh's murder trial. So they're taking an abuse of discretion perspective here. They're saying, hey, if we were the trial court judge, we may not have allowed that evidence. But is it an abuse of discretion, or could a reasonable judge have chosen to allow it? We're going to decide that even though we might have made a different decision, that doesn't mean that every reasonable judge would have made a different decision, so we'll allow it. It was not an abuse of discretion. As to the second category, we will address whether the trial court should have restricted the extent to which the state was allowed to present this evidence, that is, whether the trial court should have excluded some of the evidence because it was cumulative. We unanimously hold the trial court allowed the state to go far too long and far too deep into aspects of Murdaugh's financial crimes that were not probative of the state's theory of motive, which gave rise to considerable danger of unfair prejudice and therefore should have been excluded. As to whether the trial court should have excluded all evidence of Murdaugh's financial crimes, we have discussed the principles applicable when a trial court is asked to exclude evidence of other crimes in numerous cases, and no further elaboration of those principles is necessary here. As to propensity evidence, the difficulty lies in the application to the facts and circumstances of any individual case. Here, the trial court correctly understood the applicable principles of law and thoughtfully applied those principles to the facts and circumstances before it. The trial court explained its view of the logical connection between the financial crimes and Murdaugh's motive. The state's argument that it presented a valid theory of motive and Murdaugh's response to the fabricative motive theory is illogical, implausible, and not supported by the evidence was not a dispute for the trial court to resolve by making this evidentiary ruling that was for the jury to decide. The trial court's job was to determine in its discretion whether the state's theory of motive was reasonably plausible, and if so, whether the evidence the state presented could reasonably support the theory. We agree with the state that under the facts and circumstances in existence in Murdaugh's first trial, the trial court acted within its discretion in deciding not to exclude the evidence as propensity evidence. As to Rule 403, whether the prejudicial value outweighs the useful value, the trial court balanced the probative value of the evidence against its potential for unfair prejudice and concluded the probative value was not substantially outweighed by unfair prejudice. The trial court specifically found Murdaugh's commission of financial crimes does not suggest to the jury that the defendant has a tendency to commit murder. As we will discuss below, we find considerable unfair prejudice in allowing the state to go as far and deep into detail as it did. However, we hold the trial court acted within its discretion at admitting some evidence of Murdaugh's financial crimes. I don't want to re-step through all that testimony here. It looks like that's what they're planning to do. Conclusion. As the Fourth Circuit declared, the Remmer presumption is alive and well. It serves to protect the right to a fair trial by an impartial jury for all defendants, even dirtbags like Alec Murdaugh. Here, Becky Hill, the Colleton County Clerk of Court, egregiously attacked Murdaugh's credibility and his defense, thus triggering the presumption of prejudice, which the state was unable to rebut. As noted at the outset, Becky Hill's shocking jury interference was accomplished outside the presence and knowledge of the outstanding trial judge, He was not outstanding. And superbly competent and professional counsel for the state and the defense. I would not say the state was professional. We are accordingly constrained to reverse the post-trial court's denial of Murdaugh's motion for a new trial and remand for a new trial consistent with this opinion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I guess the South Carolina Supreme Court has 5 justices, unanimous on this decision. All right, let me take a look at Super Chats and Rumble Rants. And of course, we've all been talking about this, the Murdaugh trial. When I catch up on that's a little awkward. Let me fix that. When we catch up on the Rumble Rants and Rumble Rants and Super Chats, then we're going to transition over to our members only show, which is completing the powerful dissent explaining why Trump should win in his claim of a travesty of injustice in the $83.3 million damages verdict against Trump for purportedly sexually assaulting E. Jean Carroll. I covered the first half of that dissent a few days ago. We're going to finish that up as members only content right from here. We'll transition over there in just a moment. And tomorrow morning, you'll want to join us for the Chud Show. Chud the Builder, social media, provocateur, engages with black people out in public, uses the N-word, asks them if they're going to chimp out, and got into a confrontation with a black dude. Black dude physically attacked him, and Chud pulled out a gun, shot that dude, shot himself, and now is looking at serious felony charges. The question is this a case of First Amendment free speech? Or was this criminal provocation with intent that strips Chud of the justification of self-defense for firing that shot? And as the title suggests here, we'll be talking about legal reality, not how people feel about this event. People have strong feelings about this event because they have strong feelings about the African American community in our American society. And a lot of those feelings are perfectly legitimate. The question is, are they legally relevant to this use of force event? And I think a lot of people will be surprised to learn that they're not. They're not. However true those concerns may be. We got a new member. Whoop. Welcome to the family. Welcome to the family, Swamp Sagacity. You'll be able to join us for our members only show. We're going to in just a moment. Keir North says legal vices, rest in peace, Jeff, indeed, also knew that Becky Hill messed this up. Well, he was a very good lawyer, Jeff. Miss him every day. Kate Juris, $5. Branca, share your opinion of a suggested standard or statute to better remedy judicial prosecutorial bias, prejudice of process. It's very difficult to do. The rules we have work for prosecutors, for police, for judges, for jurors who have honor and integrity. They're not good guardrails for people who are comfortable in engaging in corrupt practice. And I'm not sure what kind of guardrails you could put up. I mean, there have been societies that had to abandon jury trials entirely because they could not be run in a legitimate way. Jurors were not acting on an impartial basis. They would just vote for their tribe. Part of the consequences of being in a multi-ethnic society without a common set of cultural norms and expectations. The answer is not to have a multi-ethnic society without a standard of cultural norms and expectations. That's the only solution I see. I don't see a system that you could devise that works in a multicultural environment. There's too many friction points where each cultural group engages. Me Mama, $2.99 super sticker. Thank you very much. That's much appreciated. And over on the Rumble Rants, is it going to let me pop that out? There we go. Manola gifted 5 subscriptions on Rumble. Thank you, man. That's really kind of you. I appreciate that very much. And now we're going to transition over to today's members only show. Oh, I just have to find it again now. What did I do? Oh, here we go. Finishing the powerful dissent, explaining how Trump should win on this $83.3 million judgment against him brought by E. Jean Carroll. I'm going to go ahead and launch that. Let me get that running. Get the background music going. Let's see. There it is. All right. Travesty of Injustice Part 2 is going live right now on YouTube and locals for members. Become a member. It's only $5 a month to be a member, folks. 16 cents a day. You get double the number of Branca shows. I'll see you all over there in just a moment. All of you. I hope it's all of you. Until then, I remain attorney Andrew Branca for The Branca Show.